Good afternoon, everybody. We happen to have 4 speakers on the programme who it dawned on me that there's over 200 years experience between us. And I thought it was unlikely to get that amount of experience and knowledge in one place, probably again. So taking the opportunity to have a discussion between us, a sort of beekeepers jam session, if you get what I mean. We've got Randy Oliver, who's kept bees for over 50 years, 1,500 colonies in North Carolina. He is well known for his scientific approach, giving information on his website. Mike Palmer on the end, again over 50 years experience, running around about 1,000 colonies in Vermont. And he willingly teaches sustainable beekeeping methods worldwide. Andrew Abraham's on my immediate left. He's the sort of baby, if you get what I mean, because he's just coming up to 50 years. For various reasons, mainly the size of the island, he keeps about 60 colonies of bees commercially in a close population in Colonsay, which is a small island off the west coast of Scotland. He's in a reserve where only AMM can be kept. Now, his bees are of interest to scientists because they're varroa-free and of course of the racial purity. And then there's me, Roger Patterson. I've been keeping bees for over 60 years now. I now run about 35 to 40 of my own in West Sussex. I'm the apiary manager of my beekeeping association. And during the summer, I can manage directly up to about 100 colonies. That's for honey production, teaching, and queen rearing. Now, we've all come from very different, or we all come from very different situations and climates. An example, as I just mentioned, that Andrew has pure bees with no varroa, which the other 3 don't enjoy. But we all have similar problems, and we may deal with them in different ways depending on our own situation. As we've heard, and it always happens, bees prevent situations that need dealing with on the hoof. You can't consult books or screens when you're out in the field. Some of what we might say may not be accepted by the exam board, so but they work. So perhaps if it's not the right answer for if you go in for the exams, then perhaps you ought to do what you're supposed to do. But it's surprising what you can do if you understand what's happening inside the colony. This is just going to be a general discussion, weaving in a few questions that have been sent in. We won't be taking questions from the floor, and I can assure you absolutely nothing has been rehearsed, so I don't really know where it's going to go to. But I'm going to start off with a topic that has become, let's say, popular, and like a lot of things in beekeeping, different people have got different views in them, about them. And the point I'm going to make is that in a natural tree cavity, it's well insulated with a small entrance, usually towards the bottom. Should this inform the decisions we make about siting hives, insulation, ventilation, and the entrance sizes in our conventional hives? Andrew, can you pick that one up first?
Okay. I will answer that, Roger, by taking you off to Tasmania, Kangaroo Island, where I've worked. That's Australia, and have seen in multiple cases great swarms of bees in caves. And next, very close to these caves are trees. And my question was always, well, why on earth would you go and choose a cave for your nest site when you could have gone in a tree? And so I've spun that completely 180 degrees to open the conversation. And bees don't, in my experience, always follow rules. I've seen swarms on Colonsay, and you would think, why on earth did they choose that site? So as far as then going on and saying the hive entrance has to be small, etc., I actually use wide entrances for different reasons. So yeah, that kind of opens up the discussion.
Mike?
Yeah, I think you can learn a lot from a bee tree. If you follow what bee trees do. I mentioned it today that, or yesterday, that swarming, a lot about swarming can be learned by looking at a bee tree to see how they perform through the winter, getting into the top of the cavity, and then being driven down by incoming nectar in the spring, and how that can cause, can instigate swarming. And I've always believed that it's that incoming nectar driving the queen and the cluster down in the cavity. That incoming nectar is, you know, going in the brood nest, going where the queen should be laying, and the queen can't find a place to lay, so she has to go down in the hive. And so that downward pressure is actually the prime trigger, in my opinion, for the instigation of swarming. So yes, and there's many other things that you can learn by following what colonies do in a bee tree. So you can imitate a bee tree in your beehives. Have a double deep or whatever it is you use, and don't put any supers on it, because nobody supers a bee tree. And don't put any supers on it and see what happens. And it's imitating a bee tree. So you can really learn a lot from how a colony in a bee tree reacts to different stimuli. And everything bees do is, it's not pre-planned, it's a reaction to stimuli.
Randy, ventilation, what's...
Honeybees don't always have a choice of the ideal cavity. They're going to take the best cavity they can find. It's often very limited. So by looking at trees and saying, you know, they want a high or low entrance, they generally don't have a choice. What they do have a choice on is what they do with the entrance they have. And just like if you talk to anybody who does heating and air, they say one opening to whatever building. You never have two openings to a building with a heating and air system, because you can't control it, because you're fighting thermodynamics. So what honeybees do the same thing. They close down to one opening. So where that opening is, that's can have some differences, but the main thing is to avoid thermosiphoning. That requires two openings at different vertical levels. Honeybees close down to one.
I'd give probably a similar answer. It's a case of what's available to the bees, and that just happens to be what a tree cavity is. But I think it's worth expanding the question, or the point really. What about a chimney? Because that's got a bigger entrance at the top, you know, and the bees still survive. And you know, there's an awful lot of chimneys with bees in. So that brings me to another point, that ventilation. What about insulation, overfeeding, or, you know, yes, overfeeding, mollycoddling bees? Do you think it keeps bees alive that perhaps nature would discard? Randy?
So, you know, I was having that discussion with Andrew, and my stock of bees, which we breed for almond pollination, if we don't feed them or mollycoddle them in any way, they survive just fine. But they're not big for almond pollination. But that doesn't mean they're going to die. They hunker down if there's no pollen coming in. They have a small brood nest. They stop breeding brood. If there's a pollen flow in the fall, they'll winter they put on plenty of honey. So I don't see any, the effect of saying, well, we're going to take some of them and feed them to make it bigger for almond pollination. That's just what would happen if the weather happened to change and there was more water and there was a natural flow. So we're just creating a an unnatural flow, but it's a flow that could have happened easily. If I would have moved the bees to a slightly different area where there was flowers blooming then, that would have happened naturally. So to say it's unnatural feeding, I think that's begging the question. You're loading the question before you answer it by saying the feeding is unnatural.
Andrew?
Yeah, I would go along with that. I am also concerned with artificial feeding, particularly pollen, for stimulation. I think it's a slippery slope for beekeeping worldwide. I think I said in my talk that agriculture, generally pig farming, poultry farming, has gone down road, salmon farming the same. And inevitably, antibiotics are coming to prop up a system that is really running too hot. And that is my concern, that once you've done it once, it works. Without a doubt, it works. But the machine's running too fast, and you need the antibiotics to maintain it. And we all know what's happening to antibiotic resistance worldwide. So I guess my point is I would like to see it not beekeeping generally worldwide, not getting on that conveyor belt.
Yeah, we do see a lot of people treating things prophylactically and feeding just for the sake of it because they're told to, rather than actually looking at the colony and deciding whether they do want feeding or not. Mike?
I don't use antibiotics. I don't see the need for it. But I'm not surrounded by any beekeepers that have an issue with American foul brood disease. Now, occasionally I get a European, and European doesn't seem to respond to hygienicness. So the very few that I have that have European, I would use terramycin on, enough so that it really cleans it up. And I'm not seeing it get reinfected over and over after I stop medicating. But we do feed sugar when it's necessary. You know, I'm like Randy, you know, if I have a colony coming out of winter that's at risk of starvation, of course I'm going to give them sugar. Of course I am. But I don't take all the honey away. I want them to winter on, I want them to winter on honey, not on sugar. So I would never take all their honey away and feed them back sugar to make it up, because honey is more valuable than sugar. You know, we weigh all our beehives. So I weigh every hive we have, a production hive, and they have to weigh 155 to 160 pounds. And I'm told, oh my gosh, how much honey is that? Well, it might be 75 pounds of honey that's in that hive. Oh, well, that's terrible. You know, you're overfeeding. No, I'm not. I'm not overfeeding them. And so what if they need 75 pounds of feed? Gosh, they made it. It's theirs. Why should I care? Why should I take it all away and feed them sugar? So, no, yeah, anyway, that's how I feel about feeding and antibiotics. And, you know, I think we possibly do investigate what's going on in our bees. I mean, I keep hearing beekeepers, you know, I read the forums and I do like that. And people start saying things like, well, I didn't get to check the bees last week. I always check the bees on Saturday, and I didn't get to check the bees last week. So now I'm going to check the bees this week, and the queen is gone. And there's emergency cells. What do you think happened? You had to talk about Burkholm on the side and killing, then how many beekeepers you see killing the queen because they're over manipulating the bees. So, you know, for me, once I get the colony where I want it, and the honey flow is starting, and everything seems to be in good shape, we leave them alone. We manage the supers, we don't manage the bees. So, you know, that's the difference between a bee tree and and a made hive, like a Langstroth or something. You know, we don't over manipulate them, and they do quite well.
Right, that brings us on to something else. Probably we'll start with Randy on this one. Do you think the difference in acidity of honey and sugar is harmful to bees?
I don't think honey is harmful to bees. It's more acid than sugar.
Well, honey, yeah, honey, the acidity of honey is about 3 point some odd, and sugar syrup is 6 point some odd. So they're both acidic, but honey is more acidic than sugar syrup. Do you think that that harms the bees if they're fed sugar syrup?
Well, because it's less acidic?
Yes.
Oh, we certainly haven't noticed that. Bees are very adapted for bringing in nectar, which is, I don't know off the top of my head what the acidity of nectar is, but I imagine it's closer to neutral. So if they're adapted for eating nectar, I would think they seem to be adapted for sugar. Similar like feeding hummingbirds, you know. Insects or animals that are adapted to feeding on nectar do pretty well on sugar syrup.
Well, I certainly never noticed any problem anyway, but it's something that's been... Mike?
Hummingbirds that are fed honey have issues because it can give them beak cancer. So okay. I don't know. As far as sugar goes, at one time, maybe for one season, because somebody scared me on the internet saying, you have to acidify the syrup. So what is it? You put a quart of orange juice into a barrel of syrup or something like that. I did that once. I never did it again. I don't see any issues. The bees take the syrup, they do with what they want. They make it the way they want it, they ripen it the way they want it. I don't think there's an issue.
My first 25 years, I never fed sugar to hives. I thought, oh, that's unnatural. So I never fed a drop of sugar for 25 years. Never fed anything artificial to my hives. And then, you know, established beekeeper says, well, I don't know if it's good or bad, but boy, you put a gallon of sugar syrup on a hive and it's like waving a magic wand in the right period of time. I thought, well, am I just being too idealistic rather than realistic? And found out, wow, yeah, sometimes putting a gallon of sugar syrup is like waving a magic wand over a hive and can be very valuable. So I thought, God, let's separate ideology from reality.
I do disagree with feeding one-to-one syrup in the spring to stimulate brood rearing. But remember where I am. So we have a very good spring flow, starting with maple and going into dandelion. And the bees are stimulated quite well enough to expand their brood nest. So if the bees need sugar, if they're light on food, why would you feed them something that's half water? I feed them 2 to 1. I always feed them 2 to 1 if they need syrup. If they don't need a feed, if they're not in a threat of starvation, if the nectar is now coming in and the spring is starting off well, I would never give anybody any sugar syrup.
Andrew?
Yeah, I use fondant, but that's only because it's convenient. I'm doing other things, and the back of the van is full of oysters or whatever, and you spill a gallon of syrup in it, and so fondant is when I need it, is what I use, but that's for my convenience, and I find it works well enough for me, so I would do that, yeah. Biologically,
the 1-to-1 sugar syrup, 50%, is more stimulating to the colonies than the heavy syrup. If you track it when it's fed, the heavy syrup goes into storage, where that the less sugary syrup goes to feeding the brood. For feeding the brood, they need about a 70% moisture content, so they need a lot of moisture. So feeding heavy syrup will be non-stimulatory to brood rearing. So the question is, what is your intent? Heavy syrup is much more difficult for the bees to process. It takes more work because it doesn't go through the proboscis very well. They prefer a syrup of about 50-60% sugar because it's easier to take up the proboscis. So it depends on what your goal is. All of these questions depend on what's your goal. If your goal is to add winter stores, then feed a heavy syrup, which takes less processing, less evaporation of water. If your goal is to stimulate brood rearing, feed a light syrup, because they need that moisture in the syrup. Otherwise, they're going to have to go out and forage for water independently and add it to that heavy syrup.
Now I'm just talking about risk of starvation, feeding sugar syrup. As I said, I don't feed for stimulation. I only feed for, to prevent starvation. So we can look at colony when they're coming out of winter, and you can tell that these bees are not going to make the dandelion flow or the maple flow. The maple flow is an amazing flow, but it doesn't happen all the time. I've seen the maple flow save so many colonies from starvation. Should we feed? Shouldn't we feed? God, we better feed. The maple flow happens, and now they're well fed. I don't give them sugar syrup. I would never give anybody sugar syrup just for stimulation or just because they think so. They need it. I give it.
I think also access to water. We've plenty on the west coast, so the bees really always have good access to water. And if you're overwintering on heather honey, quite often in the brood chamber, there's granulation by the spring. And to break that granule down, the bees need water. And that can be problematic if you're in a dry area. But certainly on the west coast, we have no problem with that. The bees can get out, get the water whenever they need it for, as Randy was saying, getting it into something that the brood is needing.
If you had the choice, would you prefer heather honey or syrup for feeding?
I would go heather honey. I know the years that we haven't had a good flow on the heather, and you've maybe had to feed syrup. Well, I would use fondant, as I was saying, but they never come away as well in the spring as if they're on honey, and it would be heather honey with us. They never build up the same as quickly because heather honey's got a lot of pollen in it, and that's a great source for building up. They don't have to get out to get the spring pollen, and if it's very windy, then it saves a lot of flying hours if the pollen's in there with the remnants of the heather honey.
That's a very good point. Depends upon, when you just say feeding honey, or them having honey versus sugar syrup, depends on the honey. The beekeepers in Canada, if you try to winter your colonies on canola honey, they're all going to die. Yeah. Okay? They do much, so they have to remove that and feed back sugar syrup. In California, if you have a honeydew from the oaks stored, the colonies do very poorly. If you feed them sugar syrup, they do much better. So you can't just generically say honey. Depends upon what honey it is.
In Canada, I saw open feeding, which we just don't do in this country. But for those who don't know, it's just 40-gallon barrels filled up with syrup and then some vegetation on the top, like straw, so that the bees can just go in and help themselves. And where I saw it, the beekeeper kept 40 colonies in each, as they call them, yard. And I was absolutely amazed that the colonies, they didn't rob each other. Robbing wasn't a problem. And also, each colony took fairly close to the same amount. So is open feeding common in your area, Randy?
It's not particularly common in my area because you wind up feeding your neighbor's bees. And I mean, if you want to be generous, yeah, you could certainly feed your neighbor's bees, but if you have very many neighbors, they're going to equally feed at the trough. So only unless you're isolated would you tend to do that. There's also the question about disease transmission or pathogen transmission. So I myself don't do open feeding, but some people do.
Mike,
I don't know anyone that open feeds in my area. Not at all. In the early spring, before they can fly, we have an issue. It's so cold they can't fly, and we feed them syrup, and they get their guts filled up with too much moisture or something, and they get dysentery, and they have to poop in the hive, and they die in the snow. But if they're at risk of starvation, that's when we give them fondant. That's when we give them fondant. Other than that, once they can fly, at least occasionally or regularly, then we can give them sugar syrup if they're at risk of starvation. But many springs we don't have to feed anything. They've got plenty. See, because we feed them to a target weight in the fall, 155, 160. They're good until at least April. Almost every colony. Remember what I said? They're all different. And so some are different than others. Some will eat more than others. Some will raise brood earlier than others. So you have to look at the hive, and if it's at risk of starvation and they can't yet fly, you feed fondant. If they can fly, you feed syrup, but only enough to keep them going until the first flows.
Feeding syrup takes labor and money. So I tend to winter our colonies on honey, only if, similar to Mike, going into winter, they're underweight, then we will either swap combs of honey to them or supplementally feed. And we feed them to a heavier weight than most because of our fear next February or March of them starving in the almonds. They go to the almonds, they brood up on the pollen very rapidly. When they brood up, they start burning through those honey stores. So like I said, they get pollen first in the almonds, then they get nectar. Well, if it rains when the nectar's coming in, now they've got a huge amount of brood, and the strong colonies will starve right in the middle of horizon to horizon almond flowers because they can't get the nectar. It's not the weak colonies that starve, it's the strongest colonies that starve. So that's why we make sure they go into almonds heavily, because we don't like doing any spring feeding at all. We'd rather have them good clear through till the honey flow on the honey from the year before.
I'm the only one who wouldn't be feeding his neighbour's bees. So I've no experience of it, but one person in Scotland who had a lot of experience and did a lot of research work was Bernard Mobus, north of Scotland College of Agriculture, and his papers are still there today. And he used to do a lot of feeding outside. He even put a solar warming cabinet over the top of the feeder, in the sense that when the bees landed, once they'd taken up a cold bellyful of syrup, on a cold day, they're struggling. Their temperature, their core temperature has gone down, and they're struggling to get back home. So he played about with a solar warmer, and they found that that was quite effective, because the bees would come out on the sunny day, the syrup would stay warm, and the bees got, all of them, or most of them, got back home. So that's the experience of one man in the, I think it was in the 1950s and 60s, he did those experiments. So maybe worth a try in cold areas in a cold spring.
I just see a Scottish bee saying, oh, this tea is a little bit too chilly for my taste. Would you mind warming it up a bit for me?
We've heard quite a bit about nutrition, which has been dotted through the presentations. Certainly in this country, I've only ever come across pollen shortage on one occasion. You folks seem to have it obviously more than we do. Can you just briefly run through how you would prepare the pollen patties, and when you would put them on? I mean, is it when you got no pollen there, or do you just do it as a matter of course, or what? Randy?
We don't do anything as a matter of course. Those of you who saw my last presentation, we do everything based upon the needs of the colony. We look at the amount of jelly around the larvae, and we look at our goal. Any bees that you rear in August will never make it to the winter. So if you're feeding in August with pollen sub, you're just raising more varroa. So we would like to have our colonies actually shut down in August and then start rearing brood in September and October. So we look at our plan, and we look at our colony sizes. If the colonies are large enough, or if it rained in October and there's bloom on, there's no way in the world we're going to feed. So again, any question somebody asks me, the first question I ask back is, what's your goal? Okay, if your goal is to avoid swarming, no, don't feed. If your goal is to make big money in almond pollination, you get paid by how strong the colonies are, then there is an appropriate time to feed. Not before you've controlled varroa, after you've controlled varroa. So again, anybody gives you a pat answer is not telling the whole thing. They first have to ask you what your goal is before they can give you an answer.
Right.
You know, I do feed pollen substitute in the spring before natural pollen is available. Heather Matilla at Holyoke College in Massachusetts did a pretty nice study years ago. And she found by measuring brood area and things, it seemed to her that about once in 4 years, the bees could use a pollen supplement, a protein supplement in the spring to keep brood rearing going. Because, you know, our bees store their pollen from a goldenrod and aster in the fall. And then make whole combs full of pollen in the fall. And brood rearing can start in March. And they're using that pollen, stored pollen, to start brood rearing. And then natural pollen comes in, and there they go. They've had enough to get them through that time of no incoming pollen. Well, sometimes we have a delayed spring. I mean, think about it. We start raising brood in March, and they never have any pollen until the middle or later in April. Boy, if they run out of pollen, then brood rearing shuts down, right when we don't want brood rearing to shut down. And so we give everybody a pound or two, a couple pounds of a nice blob of pollen substitute on the top bars, and it's usually gone by the time natural pollen comes in. If you wait and you put the pollen substitute on a colony and pollen comes in, it's going to still be there a month later. I mean, they're not going to eat it if natural pollen is coming in. So really what we're trying to do is give them enough pollen so that they can continue brood rearing right through into maple and dandelion. And she said, you know, about once in 4 years it's necessary. Well, when is that? What of those 4 years is it necessary? So you don't really know what year it's necessary until it's over. So we give them a pound or two of pollen substitute, protein substitute in late March, very early April maybe to finish up, and then it's gone by the time natural pollen comes in. So that's the only time we ever feed. We have so much pollen coming in the autumn from goldenrod and asters that, I mean, it would be a waste of money to feed. And also, we don't have small hive beetles very much, but you can be a pollen sub can be an absolute breeding ground for small hive beetles. So it's really, you gotta understand your area. You gotta understand what's around and when the pollen comes in, and so that's basically when we feed.
Andrew?
Yeah, I would, and again, as the other speakers have been saying, every year is different, and so you're looking at the condition of the bees and what they need. And if we hit a very late spring, and we've had them not so much recently, but in the 80s there were 85, 86 was terrible for the bees across Scotland. And if you had pollen for weak stock, it made such a difference, because the older bees that have come through the winter, they're fading away, and they're the ones that have to get the pollen in. And if they're having to do it in very windy conditions, if the pollen isn't handy for them, you're overstocked, even with small numbers of hives in certain areas. If they've got to fly over half a mile in windy conditions, they're weakening and they never get back home. And so that's when if you've got pollen patties that come out the freezer over the winter, very, very valuable with weak stocks, weak nukes. Build them up, keep them going until the weather breaks and the natural pollen comes in.
Local adaptation of bees, that's been something that all three of you have mentioned. A lot of beekeepers, especially the smaller beekeepers, will just buy a queen in. Mike, what would be your advice to people with smaller numbers? Should they try to understand a little bit about their locality and how different bees might react to it?
For sure. Smaller beekeepers are really at a disadvantage. You know, they don't have enough stock to run a proper breeding program. I'm not saying that you can't raise queen cells with 10 hives of bees or 5 hives of bees or 2 hives of bees, but it's very difficult, and you're using up the resources of your bees. And so I can see at that time buying in queens. I can see that. What I can't see is larger beekeepers, you know, 100 hives of bees, hundreds of hives of bees, 20,000s of hives of bees, not raising their own stock, but buying queen cells from Florida or queens from somebody because they haven't got the time. I believe that you don't not have the time. You know, it's such an important part of my operation, and I think it should be part of all larger beekeepers' operations to raise their own bees. Suppose you had 10,000 hives. You know that there's bees out there in that 10,000 hives or 100 hives or whatever it may be that are really good stock. And so you're going to ignore that and buy queens from what you don't know? Or are you going to the common practice of requeening by the calendar? So you're going to requeen every hive every year so you have young queens, or every second year because you'll have young queens and to prevent swarming? I kind of like to see what my queens will do. I want to select for longevity. I want to select for colonies that will perform in my area the way I want them to perform in my area. And why would I buy queens from, say, Georgia or Texas or California when I'm in northern Vermont on the Canada border, and I want them to perform well there? And yet I'm buying somebody else's stock from somewhere else that doesn't have a clue about what winter is, and the bees don't have a clue what winter is. Is it 100% failure? No, of course not. But in the long run, I think that you can actually raise better queens than you can buy. And so I think it's really important, if you have enough bees to do the program, to run your own breeding program.
Andrew?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the conditions that I'm beekeeping in are at the extreme. And my black bees are well adapted to take on those conditions. But there are many areas in Britain that are completely different climatically, and you know, local bees will definitely, over the long term, you know, they know what's going on in the local area. So I would always say try and do some selection, or more importantly, the bees will probably select themselves. It's been well known that in the north, the imported bees, if you don't do anything, they just generally disappear and over time. And so it's the continual importation that keeps the foreign stock going. If they didn't get that continuous genetic importation, they just wouldn't survive. So I would always say trying to get locally adapted is really what beekeepers should do. But go along with Mike's comments about the difficulty of raising local bees. The only way you can really do it is as a group of beekeepers getting together and sharing the workload of raising local bees. And it didn't need to be complicated. You know, you don't need to graft, you don't need to have many nukes. You can do it simply with 5-frame nukes and et cetera, et cetera.
And that is how smaller beekeepers should be approaching this as a group. You know, as your beekeeping group. You know, raising queen cells and using queen cells. You know, then you don't have to have mating nukes or something like that, or even raising mated queens. Yes, it's much easier. It's much easier on you and your bees that, you know, if you have a program, you know, with resources that you can help, you can work with, you can do some of the work with it, you can do some of the investment in it, and to get local stock rather than buying, as I said the other day, are you serious? You're buying queens from southern Italy? Seriously? Do you want small hive beetles? You don't want small hive beetles. And there's other things out there too, so that's just a one reference to small hive beetles, you know.
I think Tropilelaps is the one thing which...
If we do that, if we get Tropilelaps, we're in big trouble. Tropilelaps will kill your colony of bees in 2 or 3 months, not 2 or 3 years.
Just a question. Tropilelaps has been notifiable since 2006, so 17 years. How many of you could actually identify Tropilelaps in a colony? Small number. It's notifiable.
And they chew the app out of the bees. I mean, they butcher the bees. They don't just have a feeding spot. They bite the heck out of the bees, and they'll kill your bees and quickly.
If anyone's in any doubt, there's a lovely video by a man called Samuel Ramsey. So just have a look at it. We get back to you, Randy.
So let's just say you wanted to have a milk goat. Would you get wild goat that would survive without any care? Or would you get a domestic goat that required some shelter, maybe some feeding? Both of these guys are talking about feeding their locally adapted stock. So they're no longer locally adapted stock. Those are stocks that survive with supplemental feeding. If you're going to grow tomatoes, are you going to use a wild tomato that can grow in that environment without any help? Or are you going to take one that requires fertilizer and feeding? So the choice is, are you want to keep a domestic animal, or do you want to keep a wild animal? If you want to keep wild stock, then just wait for a swarm to move in. If you want to keep domestic stock, then you may get a stock that is, when you talk about the environment, you're creating a different environment. When you make a man-made hive, that's a different environment than a tree cavity, okay? If you want to go for maximum honey production, that's a different environment than you want for a colony that winters with a smaller cluster. So the choice is, when you talk about locally adapted, what's local? The environment that you create or the unmanaged environment? Okay, so that's your question. So for me, I agree also, I can't imagine having an operation without raising my own stock. I want to raise a stock that's adapted not only for my environment, but for my management. So my management goal is to have strong colonies for almonds, colonies that don't need treatment for mites, colonies that do well at my temperatures there. So whether they would be a wild type bee, which may have different traits, or one that's adapted to the environment of what my goals are for those bees, I'll go for the ones that fit in my goals, the least amount of management necessary. But in my area, those would not be, like, if I kept Russian stock in my area, they do very well with no management, but there's no way I'll get paid for almond pollination with them. And there's a hell of a lot of work with them because they swarm too much in the springtime. So they would be a pain in the butt for me to raise, and they wouldn't make money in almond pollination. So even though they'd be very good locally adapted stock, it's not the stock I would want to keep. How's that for?
I think, sorry, if I could add that, there is a middle ground. And the middle ground was there in the pre-Varroa time because there was always a local population, a locally adapted population of bees. That influenced the bees that beekeepers kept. And that, I feel, is the ground we need to get to again, where you do have bees that survive Varroa, and there are plenty of them around, and that they survive in the conditions that they are presented with, local environmental conditions. And they will feed back to the bees that beekeepers keep. And so that is the middle ground that I think is the ideal. We have the chance of, as beekeepers, of utilizing an organism that is both wild and domesticated at the same time. And I hope we get there, and certainly if Tropicalaps comes, we won't, but it is quite possible if we stop importing that we can get the wild colonies back in our local area, and they will influence the bees that we keep, and that is, to me, the ideal.
In the States, we're not allowed to import bees from out of the country since 1920 or so, 22 or something like that, 21. It's been banned. And yet the Canadians, who are part of North America, right across the imaginary border, are bringing in package bees, very expensive package bees, from Australia, New Zealand, and Chile, and, you know, where is Tropicalaps? Indonesia? Indonesia is right there next to Australia. And here we are importing thousands and thousands of package bees into Canada. Why, you think the international border is going to stop Tropicalaps from coming south? Please stop, please.
I've not imported a queen for 58 years, or not bought a queen rather for 58 years. So, you know, it is easy enough for small-scale beekeepers to actually produce their own. But I'll agree with Andrew, because I've removed a lot of what I call free-living colonies, and a lot of the colonies I see in managed colonies I never ever see in the wild. These soft, soppy things that just sit there waiting to be fed. Nature takes them out during the winter. Nature's a great selection tool in that area. Can I get back to you, Randy, please? Because you quoted on one of your slides, I think, that throughout your area where you keep your bees, you can be 4 weeks different. Mm-hmm. Right? Does that have any influence on the sort of bees that you keep in those areas, or do you just have the same sort of bees?
Well, it's just a timing. It just shifts their timing. So their springtime comes a month later than others. So it's no. So it doesn't make that much. Here's the deal: Canadian beekeepers for many, many years bought all their queens from California in the spring, their packages, and then use cyanide to kill all their colonies in the fall, extract all the honey, and then brought bees in from California. Now, California bees adapted for Mediterranean climate. Italian bees did very well going up to Canada. They would not do too well for the winter, but they did very well for the summer. The Canadian beekeepers then often had families in California, so they'd have the California producer get all their breeder queens from the best performers in Canada and then mate them out in California and then ship them up to Canada. So honeybees are extremely adaptable to different environments. So what I do in my breeding program for the Varroa resistance, we open mate our queens, and there are escape swarms, and there's feral stock around us. If that feral stock is producing drones the next year, that means they survived the winter on their own. Otherwise, they would not be producing drones. So I'm happy to have that genetic contribution from our local feral stock. And we do have, even though we try to control swarming as best we can, we do have some escape swarms. So there's a constant gene transfer between our feral stock and our stock, and I'm happy with that. Now, if I were in Southern California, where you have the ferals are Africanized and not friendly bees at all, most Southern California beekeepers, the last thing they want to do is keep feral stock because it's too dangerous for your neighbors. Okay, it can kill the neighbors' kids and they'll kill their dogs. So the best locally adapted stock would be the ferals in California. They do wonderful. They're very well adapted there. They swarm like hell. They don't store much honey. They're hotter than hell, but they're very well locally adapted. So there are some proponents of keeping locally adapted stock there, but they can't do it in the neighborhood because they're too damn dangerous. So that's an extreme case for a simple question. When I go to answer questions, I look at, let's talk about the two extremes. So that would be one extreme case. Would you want to keep locally adapted stock in Southern California? Somebody tried to get me to help them with the argument for doing that. And I said, well, it's very easy. Get your board of supervisors over, have them stand on the property line of somebody who has 6 feral colonies there that you've never looked in, have them strip down to their bathing suits as though they're swimming, and now open those colonies that you've never seen. And she said, well, that would be crazy. And I said, I rest my case.
One of the things that is changing in beekeeping, certainly in this country, is protection. Now, all of you have discussed that in your lectures. I go to do demonstrations in some beekeeping associations, and everybody must be fully booted and suited, you know, from the bottom right to the top. Not even a tunic, must have full suits. Mike, would you like to talk just a little bit about protection or lack of it or whatever? Because I think you've got a video on it, haven't you?
I'm not a very good person to talk about protection. I don't own a pair of gloves and I don't own a suit. And I own a light veil with a baseball cap, period. If the bees are if it's cold out, if the bees are a little bit aggressive or whatever, they're objecting to me looking at them, I'll wear a long sleeve white shirt and jeans. And that's my bee suit. I don't really, I mean, seriously, I light a smoker and I'm working some bees, and then I'll need some smoke to move the bees out of my way so I can put the box back on. And, oh, where did I leave that smoker? Oh, I left it back there 3 hives back on the cover, so I'll go back and get it and lose a little smoke and forget about it again. So I'm not really the one to talk about protective equipment. I do know that we had early on in our, a while ago in our Vermont Beekeeper Association, we have mentors teaching, and we had this one guy that refused to allow his new students to wear veil, gloves, suit, or anything else, because he said you won't have a natural experience with your bees. Well, come on. That's ridiculous. I mean, you got beekeepers that are just starting out, maybe a year in, you're not going to let them wear protection? They're not going to last long. So protection is, if protection gives you enough confidence over time to be able to lose the protection, at least lose the gloves, you know, go for it. But wearing a suit and a veil and gloves, man, tell you the truth, I'd rather die from bee stings than heat stroke. So I don't wear a suit and I don't wear all that.
You would like to get heat stroke in colonies, eh, Andrew?
Yeah. Yeah. I did have one experience almost like that at a beekeeping course, and when we started in the morning it was very, very chill, and everyone had their pullovers, their jacket, and then a bee suit, because exactly I always start the beginners off fully protected. At the end of the weekend, hopefully they've got no gloves on. But I hadn't noticed, of course, the sun came round, and we were standing talking, and this lady, of course, she didn't want to say, I'm getting too hot. Can I go and take my pullover off? And down she went, right in front of the hive. And it was quite a difficult maneuver to get her veil off, and thankfully I've got very steady bees, and there was a nurse in the beekeeping group I was teaching, and both of us managed to get her around and out of the apiary. So yeah, heat stroke, and I've been I've been there. But no, I totally agree that you've got to start off at the beginning being protected, but getting stung is part of the game, and get those gloves off, get handling the bees. That's absolutely the way.
I've come close to heat stroke before. It was in Mexico, and they put a jacket and a veil on me. I didn't have gloves. I had a shirt on, an extra shirt on, and we were working for maybe an hour, and it was in the shade. And you know, some of these beekeepers have scarves on, and a jacket. And all of a sudden I start to feel shaky and pukey, and that's it, I gotta go. I went down to the road, took my shirt off, I'm pouring water all over myself, and because I have, are these called pecs? Because I have pecs, and hair, they're laughing at me and calling me Tarzan. But yeah, that was close. So yeah, it can happen quickly. So
Randy,
drink some water.
we've seen photographs of you, Randy, in various states of undress. Is there any chance of seeing a photograph of you in a loincloth handling a colony of bees?
Well, I remember my kids growing up, and you know, this tall, and I had a beginners class that come over, and the people would be in their cars with the windows rolled up, putting on all their gear, and then here's these naked little boys walking around the beehives, and the people get out, they're all geared up, and we're ready to open the first hive, and I'm lighting the smoker, and my little son, Eric, says, "Oh, this is dangerous." And people go, "Oh, now we're gonna find out." He says, "Yeah, you can burn yourself lighting that smoker." So it's
Go ahead.
yeah. So anyway, I had a new assistant 2 years ago, a young gal, and I hired her. She'd never been in a beehive, but she was eager. So I had her. We were doing a bunch of mite washes. So she did the mite wash station. I would bring her bees. I didn't let her get near a beehive for 2 weeks. I waited until she was completely relaxed around honeybees, and then I took her to a beehive. And then, already being completely relaxed, slowly introduced her into working that. And within a couple of weeks, she looked like she'd been working bees her entire life. The thing is yeah, you don't start off going in naked to a beehive, okay? So at least cover your face and learn on warm days and get your confidence, get relaxed around them. Being relaxed is huge. And then slowly work yourself to other situations, you know, working bees on a cold day, and then know when you got to flip the veil on, when you got to put the gloves on. It's not like a black or white.
We used to have a bee inspector that inspected bees with a G-string. Seriously.
And what was her name?
No, I'm sorry, but it was a him. It was a fairly large G-string.
Well, it's fairly well known that I've never worn a bee suit or a tunic in my life. All I just wear is an old-fashioned veil. And it might sound corny, but I actually feel part of the colony. And I do see a lot of people who get fully booted and suited, and they haven't got a clue of what the bees are doing. You know, they're flying around all over their heads and all that sort of thing, and they're just not aware of it. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was pulled apart by somebody who's fairly high up in beekeeping, and said that because it was known I never wear a bee suit or gloves, I shouldn't be doing teaching. And I asked why, and I was told, well, I'd give the wrong impression to beginners. Well, I'm sorry, if what you wear is more important than what you know, then there's something wrong with British beekeeping, I think. Anyway, going on a little bit from that, handling bees, there's a lot more talk these days about the stress that goes into a colony when it's opened. What would you recommend for a beginner who's actually learning? You know, because if you haven't got a hive of bees open, you can't teach anyone. But at the same time, you don't want to overdo it. So is there sort of 5, 10, 20 minutes a sort of figure that you might have in mind?
I'm not quite sure the question.
The question is that we've got a lot of beginners, newish beginners in this country, and you don't want, or I don't think you want to leave the colony open too long.
Right.
But you need to open it long enough to point things out to people, and the sort of things that we've heard in the last 3 days. How long would you think is?
Oh, okay. So it depends on the conditions. So when I'm doing this, I'll say, okay, everybody notice the bee's temperament changed? Listen, can you hear the change in the pitch? Look, can you see that now we're starting to get a couple of bumps? And I point out how you read the bees. That may happen in 3 minutes. That may happen in 20 minutes. And I'll say, the bees are telling us they've had enough. time to close the colony up. You know, rather than just blasting with smoke and charging on, because I like to use a minimum amount of smoke so I don't just disrupt them, you read what the colony will tolerate. And I keep my disruption of the colony to the absolute minimum. It does disrupt them, so do my quick inspections. You know, a 10-minute inspection, there's no way in the world I'm never going to have a colony open for 10 minutes. That's just asking too much from them. With the beginners, we'll have them open for a few minutes. But for beginners classes, what I do is I set out a whole bunch of 5-frame nucleus colonies of all different strengths and sizes and queen rightnesses and health and all that. And then you can go through nukes quickly. You look at them in 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, now let's move on to the next one. 2 or 3 minutes. Nukes are very tolerant of that and short inspection rather than spending. I got invited to Cornell University to film some videos on how to manage a hive. And they gave me a printout of the steps I was supposed to take. Take the upper box off, put it to the side, inspect, remove every frame from the bottom box, put it back in there, and then go to the next box. And then they said, oh, and by the way, we had to rearrange all those hives yesterday, so all the frames would be in the wrong order and everything. And I said, you guys got to be kidding me. I said, whoever wrote this obviously doesn't know shit. I threw the damn thing away. I said, just go ahead. I'll show you how to work a colony. And no, you don't. And yes, no, I did not wear any gear because that was, of course, in there. I said, this is not the way you teach people. Show them the ideal and let them work towards it. Show them how an experienced beekeeper with respect goes into a hive, diagnoses what they want to find out and what they want to do, rather than following some ridiculous step-by-step that somebody who I don't think has ever been in a hive wrote out. So that's me.
Andrew, you teach people.
Yeah, I can't really say much more than what Randy's saying. Nuclei, that's the way.
Yeah.
Definitely the way. And have several of them and do it quickly. And yeah, and by the end of the weekend, the gloves are off and they're marking drones.
Yeah.
But the difference between getting into a nuclei and getting into a full hive, and that often is the trouble, is you see association demonstrations where everybody's booted and suited around a big hive, and maybe that's the problem, is that it helps. The theatre of it is, you know, because the hive is bigger and you can get more folk round, maybe that's it. But no, I'll just say no more than what Randy said.
Mike?
Yeah, I think it is important to be quick. You know, as a commercial beekeeper, I don't open up a hive and say, I'm looking for this, and I'm looking for this, and I'm looking for this, and are they doing this, and do I see this, and do I take another box apart, and do I do this? And the whole poor colony is all scattered and for a long time. I'd rather teach that, or what are we doing today? Why are we opening this beehive today? Are we going to check for swarm cells? Well, what does it take to check for swarm cells? There might be some supers off, you take them off. You crack the box up, you look in there, you can open up the frames like the pages of a book. You can see there's worker brood, you can see everything seems to be okay, put the colony back together and do that like that. So it really is, I think a lot of the teaching goes on that they want to fully examine, as you say, every comb in the box, every one. Now, your buddies there at Cornell, and I can only imagine which one it was, used to say in the spring in April. Now, April is, you know, like I said, we just had pollen coming in. It's chilly. You need to look at every comb in the hive to look for foul brood. Really? Every comb? No. You need to look at a couple of combs of brood. They're clean, put it back together again. Yeah. Leave the colony alone. You don't need to totally take the colony apart and disrupt them, and they're going to be offended. But it's quick. It's quick. You need to know. You don't just go at, like before I said, you know, oh, I didn't get to go in the hive last Saturday. So people are inspecting their beehive every single Saturday, a complete tear down. You got to find the queen, you got to find. No, you're looking for one specific thing once in a while. That's why it's quick. You're only looking for one thing. Examine it for that one thing, put it back together again. So we'll go down the row, and with beginners, and I'm trying to show them how we work bees, we'll go down the row, we'll open up one hive. Okay, this is what we're looking for. Nope, not seeing it, put it back, go to the next hive, open up that hive, do a quick inspection. We're not looking for the queens. We're not tearing the colony apart comb by comb by comb. That's ridiculous. That's when you get in trouble with beginners.
I think if it's somebody at home, I would agree with you. But in a teaching situation, like a local association, I think certainly the newer beekeepers, it's handy to go through from one side to the other so that you can show people how the bees have arranged their nest. You can show them all sorts of things like different ages of larva, what's pollen, what's bee bread, wax moth damage, all sorts of things like that. And it does take time to explain people, because the good ones will ask questions. But I like to think that 20 minutes is absolute maximum in that situation. If people can normally do a 10-minute inspection at home, I would agree with that. But don't forget, most people are amateurs. I think in the UK we still got, each beekeeper has about 4.5 colonies. That's all. So many of them have only got 2 or 3. Anyway, folks, we've got to close now because of the show closing. So it just remains for me to thank Mike, Randy, and Andrew, and you folk for listening. So thank you very much indeed.